right, I think we've got a fair number in the room now, so let's get started. So good evening, or morning, or afternoon, depending on where you are in the world, everyone, and welcome to Kellogg College's first event at Meeting Minds Global 2021. Hope you're all well, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Nicola. I'm the Alumni Relations Officer at Kellogg, and I'm just going to run through a little bit of quick housekeeping before we start. If you can please keep your microphones muted whilst Shreya is talking, just for interference's sake. There'll be a question and answer at the end, so if you've got anything you'd like to ask, then you can do so at that point. My colleague Sophie, wave for us, Sophie. She'll be in the chat box, so if anybody has any questions that they don't want to read out themselves or just wants to say hi, you can do so in the chat box, and Sophie will keep an eye on you. Just also a quick note, you might be able to see it already, this session is being recorded, so if you're welcome to keep your video feeds on, but if you're not comfortable with that, then that's absolutely fine. You can turn it off. Right, so now on to the event itself. I'd like to introduce everybody to Shreya Atrey, our speaker today. Shreya is an Associate Professor of International Human Rights Law in the Department of Continuing Education and the Faculty of Law, as well as an Official Fellow at Kellogg College. Shreya specialises in feminist theory, poverty and disability law, and discrimination law, and she's going to talk to us now specifically about intersectional discrimination and its place within discrimination law. I don't want to give too much away or attempt to sound like I know what I'm talking about, so I'll hand you over now to Shreya. Welcome to Meeting Minds.
Thank you so much, and welcome everyone. I believe we are about 20 people, and that's more than what I expected today. I think but when we were fixing a time for this event, we didn't quite realize this would be the 12th of April, the first day when pubs are going to be open for outdoor service. So everybody who hasn't made it out to the pub, well done, and thank you so much for making to this talk. I promise you I'll try to keep it as interesting and short as possible so that those of you who are based in the UK can do the best of getting the pint. But thank you so much for making it today. So I think I have about 30 minutes to chat with everyone, and we're about 20 of us. So we can run this fairly informally. If you have any questions about anything that I'm saying, please do feel free to put up in the chat box. I'll look while I'm talking. Please don't wait for questions in the end or whatever. You can be fairly informal. If you want to ask a question, please feel free to raise your digital hand or drop a line in the chat box. I can pick it up. You can turn your video or audio on, and we can have you talk as well. So let's keep it fairly informal so that it's not the most boring thing that you do at the end of the afternoon or wherever that you're based, and that'll be helpful for making it a bit more engaging as well. So in the next 30 minutes, I want to do three things. I want to first explain where the very dramatic title of this talk comes from, now more than ever. The second thing I want to do is to say a little bit about why I wrote this book. This was advertised as a book talk. My book called Intersectional Discrimination, which is published by Oxford University Press in 2019. But I don't want to quite talk about the nitty-gritty of the book itself. I think that's primarily for discrimination lawyers and people who work on intersectionality theory. I want to just mention why I wrote that book, because I think it resonates more broadly with everybody interested in themes of feminism and justice and transformation. I think those are the three sort of big buzzwords or themes. So I want to explain why the book was written from that very general perspective. And the last and the most important thing that I want to do is to say very generally what I mean by intersectionality. And that's going to be the bulk of today's talk. And the reason I want to do that will be explained by the first two things I say as to why I feel that no matter how much intersectionality is used as this buzzword, it seems to be more confused and more confused with other things than what it is. So defending intersectionality has become like the way of taking up the word or the theory or the work on intersectionality. So I don't want to begin from this defense. I want to reach up to it to be able to explain what's the context in which this work is done, to be able to say what exactly is the work. So let's begin with the title of this talk, Intersectionality Now More Than Ever. So I'm a discrimination lawyer, and those of us who work on discrimination/equality law always find it a bit difficult to work on intersectionality, primarily because there's no way in which intersectionality is recognized in law. So let me say two things. First, what I mean by intersectionality very basically, before I explain it in detail, is that people face disadvantage or discrimination based on more than one ground that they possess. So if you happen to be a Black woman, you face discrimination both because of your race and sex at the same time, right? So there's no way to disaggregate disadvantage for Black women or say disabled gay men based on their disability and sexual orientation, right? Discrimination or disadvantage comes entangled, is basically the very simple idea of discrimination in intersectionality in discrimination law. So this understanding of intersectionality in discrimination law doesn't quite seem to be captured by discrimination law. And what do I mean by that? So some of you may be joining from the UK, others may be joining from other parts of the world, but let me just explain from the perspective of the UK. Discrimination or equality law as we know it is captured in the Equality Act 2010. So that's the legislation which governs all matters relating to equality largely. And it's a state-of-the-art legislation, right? It's modern. It's one of the most comprehensive legislations on equality. And it basically bans or prohibits discrimination on the grounds such as race, sex, sexual orientation, gender reassignment, etc. Right? So that's the law which governs discrimination law, except there's no provision which bars intersectionality or intersectional discrimination. So if you're a Black woman and you want to bring a claim based on both race and sex, so you want to say that the reason you've been discriminated against is both your race or color and sex or gender, you can't quite bring that claim. This is because the Labour government, which basically drafted this act, had a provision called combination discrimination under Section 14 of the Equality Act, which was never brought into place. So Section 14, which actually prohibits discrimination based on two grounds, was never brought into force. And what we would think of as intersectional discrimination is actually not prohibited under UK discrimination law. So if you are a Black woman, you have to necessarily be able to show that you've been discriminated against either as a woman or as a Black person, but not both of them at the same time. Now that's quite counterintuitive. One would think that it seems obvious that if you have more than one ground or identity or protected characteristics such as race, sex, sexual orientation, disability, age, then you may be able to use one or two of them to show that you've actually been disadvantaged because of a combination of them. But there's no redressal in law for this. So it seems that for most of us who worked on discrimination law, this is the most obvious hurdle for us to be able to show that intersectionality actually exists, that there is something like facing disadvantage because of a combination of characteristics, and that disadvantage then needs to be actually addressed in law. So that's the starting point. So until now, I think most discrimination lawyers just really find it hard to be able to convey that point. But what has happened last year with the pandemic is that there's been such immense reporting around inequality associated with the pandemic. The fact that people believed that the pandemic was going to be this great equalizer, such as the climate emergency, that everybody is now going to be facing the same kind of disadvantage, that this is somehow going to be same for everyone. It's turned out to be quite the myth, right? So reporting and news around how certain groups have been more disadvantaged than the other has become so much more common in the last 1 year than in the previous years, that it seems to us that one of the big lessons from the pandemic has been that we understand that because there are pre-existing inequalities or discrimination or disadvantage that people face because of their race, sex, gender, religion, sexual orientation, all of these identities, any circumstance, any emergency or any kind of catastrophe like a pandemic or a climate emergency or a refugee crisis, when that hits, it's going to interact with these pre-existing disadvantages and exacerbate what some of these disadvantaged groups face, right? So if you're a Black woman who's poor and is a single mother, all of your characteristics, which is race, single motherhood, single parenthood, class, and gender, are going to interact and exacerbate the disadvantage that you face, right? So all of the reporting around this has really highlighted that people are not exactly placed on this even plane of being just this genderless, raceless people. That everybody is situated in these highly complex and variegated ways. And to understand how all of these different kinds of identities interact in producing the disadvantage people face is now becoming more and more commonplace. So it seems to me that it's now more than ever that we really need to tease out and nuance our understanding of what do we really mean by these disadvantages entangling and constituting one another. So what do we really mean by intersectionality when we say that disadvantages come together, that racism and sexism work together to produce a special or a different kind of disadvantage which people like Black women produce? So that's largely where I'm coming from when I say now more than ever, as more and more sort of understanding of inequality, discrimination gets nuanced by these notions of intersectionality, we need to be even clearer by what do we mean by intersectionality in that case. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing I want to say is why I came to write this book. So I mentioned that discrimination lawyers seem to be really confused by the fact that it seems to be intuitive that people can face discrimination based on more than one ground. But at the same time, it seems that discrimination law has no tools to be actually redressing that discrimination. But here's the interesting thing about intersectionality. Intersectionality as a word was actually coined in the context of discrimination law. So intersectionality as the idea that discrimination occurs based on more than one ground or identity was coined by Kimberlé Crenshaw, who's a legal scholar who was writing in the context of US discrimination law. And she was writing in 1988, 1989, her first published work, which coined the term intersectionality. She was actually mounting a critique of discrimination law. So she was saying that it is discrimination law which is at fault to not be able to understand that Black women are not exactly facing racism and sexism separately, but there's something about the confluence. And here is how she showed that. So she brought up this classic example, which has now become classic, but at that point she was really excavating this example. But at that point, there was this case called De Graaf and Reed in General Motors, which became this talking point for intersectionality theory to be devised. So De Graaf and Reed in General Motors was about General Motors having this policy called last hired, first fired. So if you happen to be working at a plant of General Motors in the United States and you are hired last, you would be the first to be fired. Now, Black women challenged this policy as discriminating against them based on both their race and sex. What did they mean by that? What they meant was that they were the ones who were hired last, right? So all other women who were hired before them happened to be white women, and everyone else who was Black, who was hired before them, happened to be a Black man. So neither white women nor Black men were fired under this policy. It was mainly Black women who came to be hired last and hence came to be disadvantaged by this policy. So their claim was not that they were facing the same kind of sexism which all women or all other white women were facing. Their claim was also not that they faced the same kind of racism when actually Black men were being retained by General Motors. Their claim was specifically that they were the ones who were not being retained when General Motors instated this policy of being last hired, first fired. This is what Kimberlé Crenshaw showed was characteristic of intersectionality, that if you tried to constitute or imagine intersectional claims as either racism or sexism, intersectional claims would fall through the cracks of discrimination law. So this work was done in 1988 and 89. That's when the term intersectionality was coined, and it's been over 30 years since the coining of the term, and for discrimination law to have developed that understanding and to really have done something about addressing that discrimination in law. But in fact, what I came to see in my legal research was that not much seems to have been done in law about it. So even though Crenshaw wrote this robust critique and has written so much since, and intersectional studies, intersectionality studies has become a discipline in itself, very little of that seems to be reflected in changes in law. And I was interested in finding out what was happening about this concept or around this concept around the world. So I wanted to study laws generally of the Commonwealth, but also beyond. So some of the jurisdictions I was looking at were not just US and UK, but South Africa, Canada, India, also the European Union law, the European Convention on Human Rights. And I wanted to see if all of these jurisdictions were committed to prohibit discrimination based on identities or status grounds. What were they really doing about intersectional discrimination? And I came to basically a very blanket single kind of conclusion that not much seems to have happened since 1989, that laws seemed largely resistant to intersectionality no matter where we looked. So I wanted to see what is it about the tenacity, or what was it about discrimination law being such less malleable, right? Why couldn't we bend the apparatus of discrimination law to actually being able to relate to discrimination based on more than one ground? Why was it so fixated on people always arguing that they were discriminated against based on one and only one ground? Why were judges and legislators not able to see that discrimination happened in this quite organic and dynamic way, something which intersectionality theory had been arguing for so many decades? That's why I came to write the book. So the book is basically an intervention in the world of comparative discrimination law, to be able to talk to discrimination lawyers, policymakers, those interested in on the law of equality and non-discrimination, to be able to say, what do we need to do? How do we need to, and here's the imagery that I bring up in the book. How do we recalibrate the apparatus of discrimination law to be able to address intersectional claims within it? So to say very broadly, I wasn't looking to critique or to deconstruct discrimination law. I was wanting to find a constructive way out of this problem, to say that we're not trying to reinvent the wheel here. If discrimination law is a field that we have in law, if this is one of the ways for fighting for justice for those who've been discriminated against, then how do we just wield this tool of discrimination law to be able to work with intersectionality? That's what the book is about. But I don't want to say more about the book itself because it's largely on discrimination law. I just want to mention, and this is the third thing I want to mention in this talk, and for the next 10 minutes or so before I invite you all to ask any question. Please feel free to ask anything general about intersectionality, because much of the first part of the book is generally about intersectionality as an idea and as a concept. And that's what I want to talk to you about now. So the first part of the book was really wanting to tell the reader the story of the development of the idea of intersectionality. So before I went on to say what is intersectionality a la intersectional discrimination law, we had to first talk about the basic idea, the concept of intersectionality first. And to do that, I wanted to show that despite the use of the word intersectionality in popular culture, in social media, and despite the use of the word as a buzzword of sort, it's actually a big theoretical field of studies which has existed not only since 1988-89, when Kimberlé Crenshaw was writing in the context of discrimination law, but something which went far further back, in the last 2 centuries, in fact, and to show and to map how different kinds of feminist cultures were wielding this idea of intersectionality for their different kinds of advocacies and movements. And a lot of this work has generally been done in the United States in the context of Black feminism. So tracing back to the speeches and the poetry of Black women who were slaves in the 1800s, Marianne Stewart, who gave the iconic speech asking a entire woman, when I'm doing the same job as the Black man who toils in the field, but also I'm the one who's reproducing Black slaves, doesn't that make me something quite different? And wouldn't you recognize that I'm both a woman and a Black person at the same time? Those kinds of ideas were very similar to the idea of intersectionality, right? And even though the word intersectionality is not quite present in this 200 years of literature in Black feminist thought in the United States, there was intersectionality like thinking, right? So a lot of this work has been done in the United States, and I wanted to draw on that work. And I wanted to show how this work also existed in the global South. So I wanted to show how patterns of this kind of intersectional reasoning were present also, say, in Dalit feminism in India. Now, Dalit feminism refers to feminism of Dalit women. Dalit refers to outcast or lower caste. It's a term of pride, of assertive pride used by people who are at the bottom of the caste hierarchy, the Hindu caste hierarchy in India. So for those of you who are aware of casteism, which is akin but not the same as racism, I wanted to draw this caste race analogy to be able to show that even though we have different names for these oppressions, and there are different conceptualizations of how we think about caste and gender versus race and gender, there are similarities at a broad level when we think of the model in which discrimination occurs, right? The similarities at that high level that I wanted to bring up to show that there's in fact solidarity of intellectual development of thought on intersectionality. And that's the exciting work some of the earlier parts of the book does, to be able to show that even though the trope or the phrase intersectionality is absent from how Dalit feminists in India, most of it rural India, were talking about how their oppression was defined by not just the cross-section of caste and gender, but also class being something which was so significant also for Black women. They were really talking of the same concept at its heart. And I wanted to, by comparing these two, Black feminism in the United States and Dalit feminism in India, I wanted to draw from this comparison the kernel of intersectionality. Right? So I wanted to come up with what I think is the essence or the basic idea behind intersectionality. Now, here's the big caveat. Intersectionality is a push against defining things as a monolith, right? So discrimination, according to intersectionality, is not one thing, right? Discrimination is not just about race or just about gender. It says that it's more complex. Let's try to look at the interaction between things. Now, to try to say that I wanted to look for the kernel of intersectionality, I'm trying to almost go against the direction of tide by trying to define intersectionality too strongly. But I suppose the motivation here was not to actually be able to say that I'm going to tell you the tell-all tale on intersectionality or give you the definition on intersectionality or intersectional discrimination in my work, but just to be able to say that there are certain motives which appear in intersectionality or intersectional theory or intersectional writing, which are recurring. They keep on appearing. And I wanted to excavate what these recurring motives were. And to be able to say, if these are the things which keep on emerging in 200 years of thought, then surely intersectionality can be defined in reference to these indices or criteria. So that's where I come in to be able to propose what I think are the 5 things which make up intersectionality. I'm going to quickly go through all of them to be able to say that this is what I observed was happening in intersectionality theory. And I draw here from Black feminist work, Dalit feminist work. And these are basically works which are seeped in sociology, anthropology, part in economics, but largely in history, cultural studies, and feminist studies. So I'm looking at these many disciplinary understandings and trying to draw what is to me appearing to be the recurring patterns of motives of intersectionality. So here's the kind of definition that I propose in the book. It's very mouthy, but I want to recite it just for the fun of it, for you to laugh about how academics do their drafting. So intersectionality, according to me, illuminates the dynamic of sameness and difference in patterns of group disadvantage based on multiple identities understood as a whole in their full and relevant context with the purpose of redressing and transforming them. Now, if you didn't catch a word of that definition, it was quite deliberate. So I want to break this down to make it accessible. So intersectionality, according to this sort of big one mouthy sentence, is 5 things. The first is the dynamic of sameness and difference. The second is patterns of group disadvantage. The third is multiple identities understood as a whole. The fourth is looking at things in their full and relevant context. And the fifth is using this idea to be transforming these patterns of group disadvantage. So transformation is the last thing. So let's go through each of them in turn, and that'll be the talk. The first thing about intersectionality is that you're imagining intersectionality as the dynamic of sameness and difference. So in terms of the imagery of this, try to imagine intersectionality as a Venn diagram. So if you have a sphere of race intersecting with the sphere of sex, and you also have a sphere of class juxtaposed, and there are 3 of these spheres which are colliding or intersecting, the portion in the middle of the Venn diagram of these 3 spheres, race, class, and sex, is defined by race, class, and sex, all of them at the same time. The other portions where either the 2 of them are interacting or none of them are interacting, so the portions which don't interact at all, are basically telling us something about how either race or class or race or gender interact, or they don't interact at all. So the Venn diagram has many different kinds of interactions. Intersectionality, which is at the center, is mapping how the portion in the middle or at the center is similar to all of these different spheres. Because what it's trying to say is that discrimination based on, say, race, sex, and class is something which is similar to race, sex, and class simpliciter. So discrimination against poor Black women, say, does not become too distinct from racism per se, that it's very much part of discrimination, which is called race discrimination. But because it's a Venn diagram, it's trying to show that the portion in the middle is also something distinct, right? So because it's the only portion of classism, racism, and sexism which comes together and interacts, there's something unique about the characteristics of the portion in the middle, which is not shared by the portions which are not interacting. So what happens is that intersectionality or intersectional discrimination based on more than one ground becomes something which is both similar to, but also at the same time different from, the individual parts that make it. So intersectional discrimination based on sex, class, and gender seems to be both similar to racism, sexism, classism, but also different from each of them or the 2 of them in combination. That's the kind of imagery intersectionality is trying to draw on when I say intersectionality is about the dynamic of sameness and difference. So Black women have used this idea of dynamics of sameness and difference to be able to show that when Black women suffer discrimination or intersectional discrimination, they don't suffer discrimination which is too different from Black men or white women. They too suffer similar patterns of discrimination, that there's some solidarity in what women as such suffer as sexism. But there's also something distinct or unique about the interaction of many grounds at once, which is something only they face. So it's to say both of them at the same time, that intersectionality is both about the sameness and difference at the same time, is perhaps the main thing which intersectionality tries to bring up. The second thing about intersectionality is that this dynamic of sameness and difference matters in relation to what we call patterns of group disadvantage. This phrase, patterns of group disadvantage, comes from the South African Constitutional Court, which very early on in its equality and constitutional rights jurisprudence thought of equality and discrimination not in terms of these small infractions, in terms of somebody said something to somebody kind of way of thinking about discrimination or racism or sexism, but about these patterns of socioeconomic, cultural, economic subordination and disprivilege. Right? So they were trying to map how people's life conditions were wholesale affected by patterns of disadvantage which were existing across time. So they were historical in nature, and they hadn't changed in the contemporary South African context post-apartheid, but also that these patterns of disadvantage were substantial. They were not small. They were not something that you could just sleep over. That these are generational and they repeated themselves and they affected life as a whole. It was not this one thing which was happening, say, in relation to access to housing or employment. Every life chance seems to be affected for people who were disadvantaged, say by their race. So this idea of patterns of group disadvantage has become very popular in thinking both about intersectionality as well as discrimination law. To say that intersectionality theory and discrimination law, or most theories which are interested in theorizing on equality or the idea of discrimination, are looking for disadvantage in a substantial sense rather than simply in fractions or single instances of some kind, to be able to map how social groups become disadvantaged over time in a substantial way. Right, so intersectionality too is interested in mapping these patterns which are historical and substantive in nature. The third thing about intersectionality is that it tries to bring together multiple identities but understand them as a whole. Now, it's again one of these things intersectionality does by saying it's not just looking at different kinds of identities in silos and breaking them down to think, okay, what does racism do? What does sexism do? What does classism do? When we add sexual orientation, what does that do? But it tries to say that, look, let's look at each of these, but then let's look at all of them together. This is the sense in which intersectionality tries to do both, by both being specific as well as being sort of holistic at the same time. This idea can be summarized in the concept of integrity, which intersectionality is very deeply and closely associated with. Integrity basically refers to the idea of wholeness, to keep something which may be made of different parts as not just a sum or a multiplication of its part, but as something which is quite whole or holistic only when considered together. This is particularly a concept which resonates with disability studies. So integrity, or the idea of wholeness or multiple identities together, has been used in disability studies to be able to say that disabled lives are not something to be looked at as deficient or incomplete in any way. That just because persons with disabilities have single, multiple disabilities, and they're also defined by, say, race, class, their gender. All of these ways in which persons with disabilities are disadvantaged should be understood as making the disabled life whole and complete, and not as something which has to be fixed. And this assertion of integrity of personality is something key to intersectionality as well, to not reduce those who face multiple disadvantages to just one thing or just being a sum of their parts, but also, but always to consider them as a whole. What do these different identities mean as a whole? And this goes back to mapping the dynamic of sameness and difference together rather than separately. So that's the third thing, the idea of integrity, which defines intersectionality. The fourth thing about intersectionality is that it's interested in mapping disadvantage in the relevant context in which that disadvantage happens. So context is extremely significant to intersectionality theory. It's interested in understanding, say, the idea of race as not something which remains constant between the UK, the US, and, say, Nigeria. So the reason I bring up Nigeria is that I always like to give this example of, for those of you who may have read Chimamanda Adichie's Americana, she has this interesting thing where she mentions that her heroine, Efemelu, she travels from Lagos in Nigeria to the United States. She takes a plane and she arrives in the United States, and suddenly she discovers that she's now Black. She wasn't Black in Nigeria, but suddenly when she arrives in the United States, she then assumes this identity of being Black. People are not Black in Nigeria, they're Nigerians. Perhaps the more relevant characteristic may be in relation to tribe in Nigeria, but not in relation to race as in color. So the idea of race, the idea of color is something which is distinct across context, and intersectionality presses us to think about mapping identities and the disadvantage associated with them a bit more closely, to think about what do these identities really mean in those contexts, rather than just mapping a singular idea of sex, gender, race from one context to another. So you just can't transport Black feminism from the United States and take it and fly it all over the world. You really have to do some in-depth studies of what these different identities mean in the different contexts to be able to work with intersectionality theory in those contexts. The final and the most interesting thing about intersectionality, and I'll stop there, is that intersectionality is interested in transformation. It's interested in upturning and undoing the patterns of discrimination or disadvantage that it uncovers, right? So it first wants to uncover what these complex patterns of discrimination look like, and then it wants to rehaul them. It just wants to completely change how these patterns of discrimination come to be in the first place. So this idea of transformation is interesting because it's not looking at improving the lives of a particular social groups, but it's trying to not feed into patterns of disadvantage which hinder almost everyone's life choices. So one of the first Black women's associations in the United States, when it was formed, they gave themselves the motto, lifting as we climb. And the purpose of that motto was really to say that through Black women's understanding of equality and discrimination in the United States, we want to be able to reimagine the world itself. We want to make sure that other groups who are similarly situated and have intersecting forms of disadvantages, say as Indigenous women, say as Indigenous poor women, say women who are disabled, for all of them, they were interested in having a theory which was interested in creating a different world, right? So intersectionality has transformative aims. It's a subversive theory. It's a critical theory. It's not interested in doing a little bit of here and a little bit of there. It's really trying to imagine, let's be radical. Let's think about how we can bring justice to groups, not just to look like ourselves or through our own position, but trying to reimagine the world which is really fair for all disadvantaged groups at the same time. And that's the idea of transformation, which I think binds all intersectional efforts everywhere. So that's all that I have to say. I hope I've said a bit about what we mean when we say intersectionality. It seems to be that intersectionality as a word is used everywhere, from Hillary Clinton's campaigning to Beyonce to people on Twitter hashtagging intersectionality, to others saying if your feminism is not intersectional, it's not feminism. It's just completely overused a term, but often not quite as well understood as it should be in terms of its very subversive, transformative aims and very sort of deep intellectual engagement, which sort of goes back 200 years as those working on intersectionality studies show. So I hope this was useful. That's all I have to say, but I'll be happy to take any questions if anyone has anything, any comments, any tales that anyone has to share about intersectionality. If you don't, that's perfectly fine as well. I really appreciate everybody who's stayed on a Monday evening to listen to this.
But the question should be for sure, yeah. I just joined the session, so so what question we can ask? You know, we need to ask questions for sure. Yeah. Very kind. So, but no other opinions about that.
That's perfectly fine. We can.
I'm going to ask a question, if I may. Shreya, hi. How did you get into this in the first place? If you don't mind me asking.
That's a good question. I got into this in the first place because in my first year sociology class in law school, my sociology professor entered the classroom and said, well, have you heard about double discrimination? And I was so stumped. I was like, double discrimination? Well, discrimination is discrimination. What's double, triple about it? And of course, she was referring to Dalit feminism in India. And she's one of the top sociologists in India. And I was so intrigued when she mentioned Dalit feminism that I was just like, this has to be something that I want to study more. And when I went on to do graduate studies, I came to know about intersectionality, and I was like, God, I knew intersectionality before I knew the field of intersectionality, which is similar to how, you know, our mums and everyone says, look, I knew feminism before you guys said feminism is feminism. You know, the word itself, the trope is not as relevant. And so I got interested to work on this from very early on, thinking like this, you know, what we call epistemologies, or the fun way of describing how knowledge is generated, is really not about, you know, calling things by their name, but really about how you can locate patterns of thinking. And I was feeling like, look, this seems to exist in Latin America and India and Southern Africa all at the same time. And so the US is not alone in bringing this up. So I wanted to bring all of these different ways of feminist thinking together. And of course, I'm a discrimination lawyer, so I just had to do it in the context of discrimination law in the end. But that's how I got interested in this. Thanks for the question.
No, thank you. Very interesting.
So excuse me, are we just talking about discrimination between men and women, or maybe in other sorts of discrimination also? It's included everything.
We are talking about all kinds of discrimination.
Yeah, so I can say also about that. You know, I also face it. You know, I'm from Russia, yeah, from Moscow originally, and I can say that I travel the world. You know, I work in Switzerland, you know, in other countries, you know, and time to time I also face with this some sort of discrimination, national principles of color of the skin, a lot of different things, you know, between men and women. You know, I'm in business. You know, my position is quite clear here. If the team member if my partner or employees, no matter who, is able to achieve results which will be satisfied by the business, by the situation, no matter woman, man, I don't know, black, white, doesn't matter, in fact, from which country the person. If, for example, it can face with necessary KPI, yes, I mean the results. So, I mean that it can be woman or man, and no matter which position can be. The most important, in my opinion, is efficiency. If we're talking from business perspective, in this case, I'm not talking about other things. So my position is quite clear about that. So I just would like to share with you that. So that's.
Thank you.
My name is Kwajik Lee. I'm just surprised. First of all, thank you very much for a very enlightening presentation. Now, I'm very surprised that being, law, it was worked by lawyers. They're supposed to learn about logic. And then my question is, the reason I'm surprised is because when you're thinking about it, when you're talking about intersection, as the from set theory point of view, it is an intersection, so it is much more special than any other specific individual part of the set. And so being a lawyer, you're talking about things are this and that, not all. And that's why I find that they are not particularly looking at this more special class. It surprises me. Can you elaborate on that? Why?
Yeah, that's such a useful question. I mean, it seems intuitive when you look at it from the set theory perspective that you'll be able to say it's both at the same time and not one at the other. But so here, I think here's what happens in law. So in law, I think courtrooms, especially judges, seem to be a bit more concerned about the proof of discrimination in terms of being able to say that something happened because of a particular characteristic. And discrimination in particular is seen not just as a legal wrong, but as something more damning in a moral sense.
Oh, so you mean social point perspective then?
Yeah, and I think they're a bit more careful in terms of looking for proof which can isolate the impact of a certain discriminatory treatment as based on something specifically, right? So they're always invested in thinking in terms of X led to something rather than X and Y led to something. Because the more you bring up different identity characteristics, they think that, well, that's not discrimination. That's just poor luck or something, right? So they're interested in isolation because they want to be particularly clear about matters of proof, which is, I think, a good thing, but I think it's not a precise enough tool to be able to wipe out discrimination. And in fact, those who work a little bit more mathematically will be able to understand that causally, you don't necessarily need to pin down one thing. Well, if there are two causes, then you can isolate those two and understand how discrimination came about. So there's no conceptual inability to do that. I think the inability is largely practical, to be isolating the proof in relation to racism at one end and sexism at one end, for example. But that's an excellent question. I think judges have been more wary than they should have been, and I think you can see the development of thought in almost all jurisdictions where people have become increasingly impatient with judges not being able to do more complex causal thinking. Thanks for the question.
The follow-up thing is what can be done, how the laws can be can address and remedy this type of discrimination.
Yeah, thank you. So I think the first big move is naturally to legislate on intersectional discrimination, to prohibit intersectional discrimination. Say in the case of the UK, this would mean that Section 14 of the Equality Act 2010, which is currently a dead letter, it's never been enforced, should be brought into force. So more public campaigning around, we need to recognize combination discrimination to allow litigants to go to court to claim intersectional discrimination would matter. So I think the first logic is largely making public funds and resources available to be able to say this happens, and our courts should be open to it. I think the rest will follow from there on for the UK at least. But I think that's the first step for the law to take to recognize intersectional discrimination in our books in human rights law. This has been done in South Africa particularly, which recognizes intersectional discrimination and does that quite well. And it remains an outlier amongst the jurisdictions that I study. But I think it also serves as a good template to say the moment you write in your laws that discrimination which is prohibited can be based on one or more grounds is just an opener for all kinds of discrimination to be recognized rather than the small packets of discrimination that we currently recognize.
As far as you know, I'm in US, so my question is, do you know anything about the law in US? I'm not a lawyer, so that's why I want to find out.
Yeah. The law in the US largely, so there are two kinds of discrimination laws which exist. One is at the constitutional level, the 14th Amendment, and the main other statutory law is Title VII, which governs employment law largely.
Right.
And Title VII is where intersectionality has been recognized. So you have seen in the US claims brought both on the basis of race and sex, but at the Title VII level, almost every circuit court which has recognized intersectionality has recognized it as limited to two grounds only. So race and sex. You cannot argue discrimination on more than two of these grounds. So you cannot say I've been discriminated against based on my race, sex, and disability, right? So if you have to be showing three grounds or more, you cannot bring that claim. And the US courts have really stopped at that point saying, look, you cannot bring too many claims which are asserting too many kinds of discrimination. We can't quite isolate what exactly led to discrimination if you say that. So that's the state of law in the US. The proof is extremely hard. It's not as dynamic and easy flowing as South Africa, but that's where the law is. Thanks so much for the questions. Really appreciate them.
Shreya, we've got time for just one more question, and I just see somebody's posted something in the chat saying, could this intersectional discrimination be incorporated into organization policies and practices? Absolutely. I think there's so much campaigning in the UK for people to be recognizing how intersectionality as an idea is operating. I think, again, more sort of openness to thinking in intersectional ways to map different kinds of discrimination happening together is helpful rather than the use of the term intersectionality, I would think, per se. So I'm just going to quickly mention the race report from 31st of March, the botched Sewell Commission report, which came out. And one of the big findings of that report is that this is not racism. We think that more is going on in terms of neighborhoods, in terms of class, in terms of people's educational background. And I think our response for so many of us who work on racism, who work on intersectionality, is that, well, you can't quite isolate exactly all of these, right? So most of the time you would see race interact with class, class interact with educational background, with neighborhoods, with gender. All of these come together in very complex ways to create the disadvantage which exists today. So we've been trying to respond to that report to say, well, you're right that these can't be isolated, but you're wrong to say that racism is the separate thing and other things are happening in disadvantage. So I think using this logic in policy-based work is so important to be able to push back against thinking in these linear, one-dimensional ways. And I think people are increasingly, since 2020, since pandemic, since the news of so much of intersecting disadvantage coming out, people are very open to be doing this kind of work and just being open to seeing, well, let me complicate this a bit. Let me see what else is going on. I think just asking that question switches you to evidence, which is more complicated. Thanks.
All right, we've come to time now. I just want to say thank you so much to Shreya for coming and talking to us on what is a very sort of topical issue at the moment, as well as being a bigger issue in general. And I think you've enlightened all of us a bit more on what intersectionality actually means, because it's a term we hear, as you say, all the time, and actually knowing what it means and how to apply it is a good first step, if nothing else. And then we can actually start getting something done about it.
Thanks so much. Thanks,
yes.
everyone.
So thank you very much, everyone, for coming, and have a lovely evening. And hopefully we'll see you again at another session soon.